Harlem, 1954. On the surface, the neighborhood was alive with music, laughter, and neon lights glowing late into the night. Doo-wop drifted from stoops, Cadillacs rolled down 125th Street, and the club stayed packed until dawn. To most people, it looked like a golden era. But anyone who truly understood Harlem knew that peace there was never permanent. It was held together by respect, fear, and one man who stood at the center of it all, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. By the mid-1950s, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster. He was a symbol, a strategist, a king who ruled Harlem not with chaos, but with control. He sat with judges, negotiated with mafia bosses, and kept violence contained when others would have let it spill into the streets. The Italian mob respected his territory, not because they liked him, but because they understood him. Harlem was Bumpy's home, and you didn't disrespect a man in his own house. But power always attracts challengers. Across the river, a new kind of mobster was rising. Younger, louder, more reckless. Men who didn't care about old rules or quiet deals. One of them decided to test how strong Bumpy Johnson really was. At first, it was small moves. Trucks crossing invisible lines. Whispers meant to provoke. Nothing that demanded an immediate response. Bumpy watched. He waited, because war was expensive, and smart men didn't rush into it. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Bumpy's wife, Mame Johnson, was known throughout Harlem. She didn't need bodyguards. She didn't need protection. The neighborhood itself protected her. People stepped aside when she walked by, not out of fear, but out of respect. She was a queen of Harlem, and everyone knew the unspoken rule. Family was off limits. Everyone except one man. A mobster looking to prove himself made a choice that day, a choice that crossed a line so sacred it erased every rule of business and negotiation. What happened on that sidewalk wasn't about money or territory. It was about humiliation, about sending a message. And the message reached Bumpy Johnson loud and clear. Those who knew Bumpy understood something terrifying about him. He wasn't explosive. He didn't shout. He didn't act in anger. When Bumpy went quiet, that's when things became dangerous. Because once family was touched, there was no conversation left to have. That night, Harlem felt it before it fully understood it. Doors closed early. Corners emptied. Word traveled fast through pool halls and back rooms. The king was moving. And when Bumpy Johnson moved with purpose, history had a way of losing people. The man who made that choice believed he was powerful enough to survive the consequences. He believed connections would save him. He believed rules would protect him. He was wrong, because what Bumpy Johnson decided to do next was never meant to be spoken about. It wasn't written down. It wasn't argued over in courtrooms or settled in meetings. It became something else entirely. A warning whisper for generations, a moment so severe that even history tried to look away. And once Bumpy stood up from his desk that night, there was no turning back. Bumpy Johnson didn't act right away. That's what made him different from the men who chase attention and headlines. He understood that real power moved quietly. While rumors raced through Harlem, Bumpy stayed in his study, listening, thinking, letting the city speak to him the way it always had. Every look, every whisper, every sudden silence on the corners told him more than any report ever could. He had spent decades building Harlem into something stable, at least by underworld standards. Numbers runners worked without fear. Club owners paid their dues and slept at home. Violence was controlled, measured, and rare. That balance didn't come from kindness. It came from trust and from knowing exactly where the line was. The problem now was that someone had stepped over it. And if that went unanswered, the entire structure would crack. The man responsible wasn't from Harlem. He didn't understand its rhythm or its rules. He came from a world where noise passed for strength and cruelty was mistaken for courage. To him, Bumpy Johnson was just an aging figure from another era, more legend than threat. He saw poetry books and chessboards and assumed softness. What he didn't see were the decades of survival behind those calm eyes. Meanwhile, the Italian families were watching closely. They hadn't ordered the insult, but they hadn't stopped it either. In their world, silence could mean approval or fear, sometimes both. A
Gentlemen,
younger generation
the plan
was
is
pushing
set.
forward,
We move tomorrow
testing
night.
old alliances,
Ensure your sectors
wondering
are
if the
secure.
old king still had teeth. What happened next would answer that question for everyone. Mame Johnson said little after that day. She didn't need to explain herself. Her presence alone carried weight. She had lived beside Bumpy through prison sentences, betrayals, and wars that never made the newspapers. She knew the cost of power and the price of retaliation. Still, there was something different now. This wasn't about the business she had accepted long ago. This was personal, and both of them knew it. As night fell, Harlem shifted. Cars slowed. Conversations stopped when unfamiliar faces passed by. People sensed movement before they saw it. Men who had worked with Bumpy for years received quiet instructions. Nothing dramatic. No shouting orders. Just simple messages passed hand to hand, ear to ear. Be ready. Stay sharp. Don't ask questions. Somewhere across town, the man who caused all this felt untouchable. He laughed louder than usual, surrounded by people who laughed with him because it was safer than staying quiet. He believed the worst had already passed. After all, nothing had happened yet. No threats, no retaliation. In his world, delay meant weakness. He didn't understand that delay, in Bumpy Johnson's world, meant certainty. Harlem had seen violence before, but this felt different. This felt deliberate, like a storm forming without thunder. The streets waited.
Gentlemen, a toast to our venture, to
because
success and no
everyone knew
loose
one
ends.
truth
Here,
that
here,
night.
precision is key.
Whatever came
Agreed,
next
let's
would
review
be
the
loud,
details.
And it wouldn't be fast. But it would be remembered. And somewhere in the dark, a decision had already been made. One that couldn't be undone. One that would leave a mark without leaving a record. The next day, Harlem woke up pretending nothing had changed. Shop owners lifted their gates. Music played on radios, and people went about their routines. But beneath that normal rhythm, everyone felt it. The tension sat heavy in the air, like a storm cloud that refused to move. People spoke more quietly. Eyes lingered longer. Harlem had learned to read the signs, and this sign was clear. Something serious was unfolding. Bumpy Johnson moved through the day like a man following habit. He met with trusted lieutenants, listened more than he spoke, and asked questions that seemed harmless on the surface. Who had seen what? Who had heard which names? Who was moving money where? To an outsider, it looked like ordinary business. To those who knew him well, it was preparation. Bumpy didn't need to rush. Time was already working for him. Across the city, word reached the Italian side. Older bosses grew uneasy. They remembered past wars, how quickly streets could burn when pride overruled sense. Some of them had worked with Bumpy for years. They knew he wasn't reckless. That worried them more than anger ever could. When a man like Bumpy went silent, it usually meant he had already decided the outcome. Not everyone agreed. Younger mobsters argued that Harlem wasn't what it used to be. They believed fear had replaced strength, that legend survived only because people were afraid to challenge them. To them, this was a moment to push forward, to see if the king still ruled or if it was time for a new order. Their confidence spread, but so did the risk. Mame Johnson watched all of this from the background. She noticed the late-night calls, the men coming and going, the way Bumpy's eyes stayed distant even when he was sitting right beside her. She had always been his anchor, the one place where the world slowed down. Now she understood that her role had shifted. Her presence alone had become part of the conflict, whether she wanted it or not. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all began to feel the change. Friends stopped returning calls. Meetings were postponed. Jokes didn't land the same way. Even in crowded rooms, he felt strangely alone. He told himself it was paranoia. That reputation always attracted rumors. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the city itself was watching him. Harlem streets noticed too. People who had no connection to the underworld sensed danger without knowing why. Mothers pulled children inside earlier. Taxi drivers avoided certain blocks. It wasn't panic. It was instinct. Harlem had survived by listening to its instincts. Bumpy Johnson understood that every move now carried weight beyond one man or one insult. This wasn't just about respect anymore. It was about what kind of city Harlem would become if lines could be crossed without consequence. If family could be used as leverage, then nothing was safe. And Bumpy had spent too many years protecting that balance to let it collapse quietly. As night returned, so did the whispers. Some said a meeting was coming. Others said someone was being set up. No one knew the full truth, only that the situation was tightening like a knot. The pieces were moving slowly, deliberately. And somewhere between fear and confidence, one man still believed he had time. He didn't realize that in Harlem, once the silence grew this deep, time was already gone. By the third night, the city no longer pretended. Harlem moved like it was holding its breath. The bars stayed open, but laughter sounded forced. Dice games ended early. Even the music felt quieter, as if the streets themselves were listening. Everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know where it would land. Bumpy Johnson spent that evening away from his usual places. He didn't sit in the clubs or walk the blocks where people expected to see him. Instead, he moved through the city unseen, checking doors that didn't need knocking, meeting faces that didn't ask questions. Men who had stood beside him for decades waited for a signal. Not orders, just direction. Bumpy never explained more than he had to. Across town, the tension reached the Italian side in a different way. Phones rang late into the night. Quiet conversations happened behind closed doors. Some wanted to smooth things over before they spiraled. Others argued it was too late for that. No one wanted open conflict, but no one wanted to appear weak either. In their world, hesitation could be just as dangerous as action. The man at the center of it all felt the walls closing in. He told himself the silence meant nothing. That fear was contagious, and this was just another wave. Still, he changed routines, took different routes, stayed surrounded. Confidence remained on his face, but cracks were starting to show. Power feels different when it's no longer acknowledged. Mame Johnson noticed the smallest details. The way Bumpy paused before answering questions. The way his hands stayed still, calm, controlled. She knew him well enough to understand this was the most dangerous version of him. Not angry, not loud, focused. She didn't ask where he was going that night. She already knew the answer wouldn't help her sleep. As darkness settled over Harlem, cars cruised slowly without headlights, stopping only long enough to exchange a look or a word. Messages moved faster than people. No names were said out loud. Everyone understood what was being discussed without needing to hear it. Somewhere, a meeting was happening that wasn't on any schedule. Somewhere else, someone waited, unaware that the city had already decided his place in the story. The balance of power hung on moments that wouldn't be recorded, decisions made far from witnesses or cameras. Bumpy stood at the edge of it all, aware that whatever came next would echo far beyond one night. This wasn't about proving strength. It was about reminding everyone what strength actually looked like. Quiet, certain, unavoidable. Harlem watched as the night deepened. Windows stayed dark. Corners stayed empty. Even the river seemed still. The city knew this was the point where stories stopped being rumors and became legends. And as the clock crept forward, one truth became impossible to ignore. When Bumpy Johnson finally stepped in the open again, nothing would be the same. Just when everyone thought the lines were clear, a new rumor slipped through Harlem like a cold draft. It wasn't loud, and it didn't come from the usual mouths. It came from someone who wasn't supposed to know anything at all. The word was simple, but heavy. There had been another meeting, and Bumpy wasn't invited. That detail changed everything. Until now, people believed this was a straight conflict, a test of respect between old powers. But a meeting without Bumpy meant someone was trying to rewrite the rules. It meant deals were being made in the dark, decisions shaped around his absence. In Harlem, that wasn't just bold, it was dangerous. Bumpy heard about it before sunrise. He didn't react right away. He finished his coffee, stared out the window, and let the silence stretch. This wasn't just about him anymore. If others felt comfortable moving around him, it meant they believed his reach had limits. And that belief, more than any insult, could tear the city apart. At the same time, pressure began to creep closer to home. Mame noticed unfamiliar faces lingering too long, cars slowing near corners they used every day. Nothing obvious, nothing that could be pointed at, But it was enough to remind her that this conflict had shifted direction. The warning wasn't loud, it was personal. On the other side, cracks started forming where unity once stood. The Italian crews weren't as aligned as they appeared. Older figures questioned who had authorized that secret meeting. Younger ones denied involvement. Trust, once shaken, began to crumble fast. And when trust goes, control usually follows. Harlem's underworld started to feel crowded with secrets. Everyone knew something, but no one knew enough. That uncertainty raised the stakes more than any open threat ever could. People began choosing sides without announcing it. Others tried to stay neutral, unaware that neutrality was becoming its own risk. Bumpy shifted his focus. Instead of looking outward, he looked inward. Loyalty wasn't assumed anymore. It was observed, tested quietly. He paid attention to who showed up uncalled, who hesitated before speaking, who avoided eye contact. In his world, those details mattered more than words. The second twist hit hardest when a trusted name surfaced in connection to that hidden meeting. Someone close enough to know routines, close enough to know weaknesses, close enough to believe they could survive being on both sides. That revelation didn't explode through Harlem. It sank in slowly, like poison. Now the conflict had layers. It wasn't just outsiders crossing lines. It was the possibility of betrayal within, and betrayal, in Harlem, had a way of rewriting history. As night fell again, the city felt tighter than before. This wasn't the calm before the storm anymore. This was the moment when storms collide. Bumpy understood that whatever move came next would decide more than reputation. It would decide who truly controlled the future of Harlem. And somewhere, someone believed they had outsmarted a legend. Unaware that Bumpy Johnson was already adjusting the story, one quiet step at a time. The night it finally broke, Harlem didn't hear a single shot or scream. It heard doors closing, phones going dead, meetings canceled without explanation. That was how people knew the conflict had reached its peak. In this world, silence like that meant decisions had already been made. Bumpy Johnson walked into the final meeting without an entourage. Just him, his coat, and that calm expression everyone feared more than threats. The room was tense, filled with men who had spent years building power and suddenly felt it slipping. No one spoke at first. They waited for Bumpy, because that's how it always ended. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone outright. Instead, he spoke about balance, about rules that kept Harlem from tearing itself apart, about how lines existed for a reason, and what happened when people decided they were above them. Every word landed heavy, because everyone in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. Then he did something unexpected. Bumpy laid everything out: names, meetings, side deals, quiet betrayals. Not with anger, but with precision. He didn't need proof on the table. His confidence was a proof. Faces changed color. Eyes dropped. The man who believed he had outplayed a legend realized too late that every move he made had already been seen. The resolution didn't come through force. It came through isolation. Allies disappeared overnight. Protection vanished. Doors that once opened freely stayed shut. The man at the center of the insult found himself alone in a city that suddenly remembered who truly held influence. In Harlem, power wasn't taken in one dramatic moment. It was removed piece by piece. On the Italian side, older bosses moved quickly to contain the damage. They distanced themselves, made quiet corrections, and restored the balance they knew was necessary. No apologies were spoken aloud, but actions said enough. Lines were redrawn. Boundaries were respected again. Mame Johnson finally saw the weight lift from Bumpy's shoulders. Not completely, it never did, but enough for him to breathe easier. She understood now why he had stayed calm through it all. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection, about making sure Harlem remained a place where fear didn't replace order. For a brief moment, it seemed like the story had ended cleanly. The insult was answered, the threat neutralized. The city returned to its rhythm. People stepped back outside. Music grew louder. Harlem exhaled. But then came the twist no one expected. Weeks later, a file surfaced. Old records, quiet reports, notes that had never been meant for public eyes. They hinted at deals far higher up, connections beyond the streets, arrangements that explained why certain actions were never recorded, why some consequences never made headlines. What Bumpy had done next wasn't just erased. It was deliberately buried. History books skipped over it. Official stories softened it. Names were removed. The truth lived only in whispers and memory. Not because it lacked importance, but because it revealed too much about how power truly worked. Bumpy Johnson knew this would happen. He had planned for it. He understood that real influence doesn't always want recognition. Sometimes it wants silence. Sometimes it wants to be forgotten so the system can pretend it was never challenged. As for the man who started it all, he didn't disappear in a dramatic way. He faded, moved away, became a footnote even in conversations that once spoke his name with confidence. In Harlem, that was a final punishment. To be remembered only as a warning. The city moved on, but the lesson stayed. Lines matter. Family is never leverage. And legends don't need noise to remind the world who they are. Even now, people argue about what really happened next. Some say the truth was too dangerous to keep. Others say it was protected for a reason. But one thing is certain. What Bumpy Johnson did after that line was crossed was powerful enough that history itself chose to look the other way. And that silence might be the loudest proof of all. After the dust settled, Harlem slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. But something underneath had changed. People still walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores, and gathered on the same corners. Yet there was a renewed awareness of how fragile balance really was. The conflict had ended without public chaos, but its lesson lingered in quiet ways. Harlem remembered who had held the line when it mattered most. Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. He never did. In the days that followed, he went back to routine meetings, quiet dinners, and long walks through the neighborhood. Those close to him noticed a softer patience in his voice, as if the storm had confirmed something he already knew. Power, when used carefully, didn't need applause. It needed purpose, and his purpose had always been Harlem itself. Mame Johnson finally felt safe enough to breathe again. The watchers disappeared. The unfamiliar cars stopped slowing near their block. She returned to her normal routines, but with a deeper understanding of the world she stood beside. She wasn't just the wife of a powerful man. She was the reason lines were drawn so clearly. Her presence reminded Bumpy of what truly mattered when choices became heavy. The Italian side quietly restored old agreements. Business continued, but with a renewed respect for boundaries that should never have been tested. Younger figures learned a lesson that no lecture could have taught them. History wasn't made by those who rushed toward attention, but by those who understood timing. Harlem had spoken without saying a word, and everyone listened. As for the betrayal that once threatened everything, it ended without spectacle. The name faded from conversations. Trust, once broken, was never rebuilt. In that world, reputation was currency, and once it was spent foolishly, there was no refund. Harlem moved on, but it never forgot. Over time, the whispers turned into stories. Stories turned into debates. Debates turned into myths. People argued about what really happened, how close the city came to falling apart, and why nothing official ever acknowledged it. Some believed the truth was hidden to protect powerful interests. Others believed it was buried out of fear. Either way, the absence of records only made the story stronger. Bumpy Johnson understood that legacy doesn't always live on paper. Sometimes it lives in the way people behave long after the moment has passed. Harlem became more careful. Lines were respected. Family was never used as leverage again. The city learned that strength didn't need chaos to prove itself. Years later, when people spoke his name, it wasn't just about power or influence. It was about restraint, about knowing when to act and when to wait, about protecting a community even when history refused to give credit. That was the part that mattered most to him. In quiet moments, Bumpy would sit and watch Harlem move around him, knowing the balance he fought for still held. He didn't need statues or headlines. The streets themselves were proof enough. They were alive, resilient, and still standing. And so the story ends not with noise, but with understanding. That some actions are too powerful to be written down. That some consequences are felt, not recorded. And that when someone crosses a line meant to protect more than pride, The response doesn't have to be loud to change everything. Harlem remembered. History stayed silent. And Bumpy Johnson walked on, exactly the way legends do, without asking to be believed.